Welcome to The Details with Adam Froer and Cecil Walker. This is a podcast where we examine the intersection between solution-focused brief therapy and current topics happening in the world. And we do this because we genuinely want the world to be a better place. So enjoy and come enjoy the details with us. So, Cecil, for this podcast, we thought that it would be a good idea to spend a little bit of time, because we're so close to Halloween and because we as Americans overdo every holiday, and Halloween is no exception. Decorations come out in full force. We eat ourselves until we're sick. We do all the things. But it did kind of make me think about this idea of so much of the idea around Halloween is engaging with things that might frighten us, things that might scare us. We kind of face our fears head on. And oftentimes, haunted houses are created to scare us from the beginning to the end. Horror movies come out at this time of year. So there's all these things that are meant to heighten our fear. And so that made me think a little bit about so many people who come to therapy are saying, I'm afraid of such and such, or I'm anxious that this is going to happen, or I have this phobia of whatever. And many times we encounter people who have fears, but at this particular time of year, it really is a cultural phenomenon that we invite fear into our lives. And so I'm wondering, as you kind of think about this idea of engaging with our fears or trying to overcome our fears, what thoughts come to your mind, or what's a good way to begin this?
I think that's a huge question, actually, but I guess that means there's a huge answer. So I'll give you some fraction of it that I can.
Awesome. I love huge answers. If you could just carry it, all of it, that'd be great. Because my fear is not having the answer.
Well, today you might face your fears. You might have to give some answers. I think there's a lot of words we can use interchangeably with fear. I think anxiety fits in its place a lot of times. I think uncertainty fits in its place very often. And so if these things are kind of interchangeable, I think we can start to look at how do we deal with all of these things similarly to how we deal with fear. And uncertainty, I think it fits so well because the things we're afraid of at some baseline, our thought process, whether consciously or subconsciously, is I'm uncertain if I can handle this situation. I'm uncertain if I could do this task. I'm uncertain that I will be unharmed if I go into whatever this situation is. So we think of like scary movies. We're uncertain what's going to happen next. The jump scares are because they surprise us and they play on our uncertainty. If we think about people's phobias that they might have, we're uncertain that we will be all right, that something non-harmful will occur if we go into whatever that phobia situation is. And so how do you correct for uncertainty is you somehow get an idea of, I think I do know that I can handle this situation. And I think, in our solution-focused conversations, a big part of what we do is, quote, reminding people that they're capable of such and such things. And that helps with that uncertainty. But I think another approach is getting to see yourself do that thing. And so maybe that's where exposure therapy and where some of these other, approaches of how to handle fear start to come into place. Because you get very direct and observable evidence. Oh, I can do this thing. I can parallel park without, something very detrimental happening. I can go to a public place and talk to a stranger without something embarrassing or harmful occurring. I now can recall that I am a person capable of doing this thing that I was fearing. So, like I said, there's a fraction of the answer of how do you handle fear?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting as you were talking, it made me think about different ways that different therapeutic approaches might encourage people to face their fears or things. And I think one of the things that it reminded me of is that our perception really does have a huge part to play in what we find scary or we perceive we need to be afraid of it. And I think, we think about really common phobias like spiders or snakes or things like that. Only a portion of the population of people are afraid of those things. And I think one of the things that really helps people to not be afraid are things like knowledge, right? The more I know, if I know certain spiders aren't venomous, then that would make it so that I would be less afraid. If I know that how to hold a snake in a way that's not going to perturb them, then I have knowledge about that's going to keep me safe and therefore reduce fears. And so I think sometimes it's knowledge that's going to help us. I think other times, like you mentioned, it might be exposure. I might change the word exposure to experience, right? If I encounter something multiple times, then it just becomes more familiar to me. I have more experience with it.
Yeah.
And therefore I know what to expect. So I think sometimes the unknown, not knowing what to expect, can sometimes make something seem bigger or larger than life. And the more times that I experience it, the more I have opportunity to change my perception of it. Things like roller coasters might be the same, right? If I rode the same roller coaster over and over and over, my body would become very familiar. I would almost have muscle memory.
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't need to be afraid because I would have anticipation of what's to come. I would know, I would have experience with how to manage that. And so I think sometimes it might be knowledge, sometimes it might be exposure or experience. And I think another thing that might be helpful is to think about consequences. And one example of that is I have an 11-year-old, and sometimes she gets anxious about going into new experiences. And I also have a niece who also has the same fear. And so we as parents were kind of talking together around, like, how do you help your child to do something that you know they need to do, right? If they need to go to school and all of a sudden everybody's looking at them, or if they have to go somewhere they've never been before and you have to help them overcome the fear of doing something new. And as we were talking to some of my in-laws, one of the things that they said is they were walking through with their daughter and they said, if you walk into a room that's full of people and they all turn around and look at you, what does that make you feel? And she said, it makes me feel very nervous. I don't like that. And they walked through and they said, how long will they look at you? And she said, I don't know, like 10 seconds or 15 seconds. And they said, well, after you walk in and they look at you for 10 or 15 seconds and you feel nervous or you feel embarrassed, then what do they do? And she said, well, then they just start doing their work, or they go back to doing what they were doing before. And they said, so what do you feel when they stop looking at you and they go back to what they were doing? And she said, well, then I feel better. And they said, so do you think you could deal with 15 seconds of discomfort knowing that it's going to end? And she said, yeah, I guess I could do that. And so the change in perspective of they're going to look at me and make me feel uncomfortable. If I know that it's time limited, now it becomes something that is overcomable. I can do it for a short amount of time because I know that the end is coming. And so I think sometimes how we overcome fear is to just think through it and say, it's a momentary discomfort. And then I'll feel a sense of accomplishment that I've done it.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating to be able to level yourself with those realistic details that are going to be coming your way as you engage with that fearful situation. But I think there's also even the flip side of that coin where you're looking at the consequences that you'll endure in a situation. You could also even look at what's the rewards that you'll get in going through and dealing with this situation. There's an enormous amount of a nearly euphoric feeling that can come with conquering something that is fearful. I don't particularly enjoy being on stages or being in front of crowds and things like that. But it does always feel really good once I'm out there and do what I say and I know I do well and I like, how things went. And it just felt energizing to engage in that kind of a way with an audience. And so you come out of it feeling good. You come out of it feeling like I did this thing that I know I was kind of a bit nervous about beforehand. And the same with other tasks, like when people do, these thrill-seeking things like skydiving, or they do mountain climbing, things like that. I think for some people, it is just innately fun in and of itself. But part of the pleasure comes from, I did this really hard thing. I overcame the risk. I put myself in a nerve-wracking situation and came out on the other side. And the relief from that risk is what causes them to feel so good. And I think you could say the same about anything that you might be fearful about, that a situation that you're going into. Look how amazing this is going to feel when you come out on the other side. And then when you frame it that way, that feeling of nervousness or fear about something is now instead a thing that tells you run away. Now it's a sign that tells you there's a reward lurking somewhere. There's something about this situation is causing you fear. And so that's the direction where a reward is for you. Now there's something to conquer behind whatever that is that's causing you fear.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I think it made me think about something I was talking to Elliot about last week, actually. And one of the things that we were kind of talking about a project that we have to do. And somebody asked a question of, well, what happens if somebody brings in a big problem? Right. And I think a phobia or a fear, sometimes that might be classified as a big problem. Or if somebody has debilitating anxiety, that might be considered a big problem. And his initial reaction was, there's no such thing as problem. And
It's a very Elliot answer.
and so obviously I was like, well, what do you mean there's no such thing as problems? And as we got talking about it, it became more and more clear to me. And he said, kind of what you were just saying, right? Is that it's a perception that if I'm going to go skydiving, then the problem is I have to get myself to jump off of this thing or out of this thing or whatever it is. And that's scary, and that might inflict pain, that, you know, it will definitely make me feel uncomfortable. And we could look at it as something like that, that's going to cause pain or it's going to be uncomfortable. Or we can look at it as that is the path to accomplishment. I'm going to learn something about myself in that process, or I'm going to overcome that difficulty, and therefore I'll feel a sense of satisfaction, or I'll feel a sense of accomplishment. So it isn't a problem, but it's a pathway to success.
Yeah.
And I think when we think about it like that, anything, a mental health disorder or a physical ailment or whatever it might be, all of those might be viewed as problems or something to be afraid of. But they also might be viewed as, this is a pathway to triumph. This might be a pathway to feeling a sense of accomplishment.
Yeah. So now things that once were scary are opportunities. These are showing you, here's ways you can unlock things about yourself, or ways you can progress forward towards being some more desirable version of yourself. And in that sense, I think of breaking fears or moving through fears as giving you access to a lot of freedom that you might have not even realized you didn't have in the first place. People like Elliot, to me, seem very fearless. Like they seem like they just have all the confidence in the world, all the ability to walk through the things that cause lots of other people fear. And to me, that looks like just the ultimate form of freedom. You know, invisible rules and tiny fears don't dictate what they do. Just they dictate what they do, how they want to exist in any space, and what they want to say, and how they want to come across to people. I think that is such a liberating thing, and that's a reward in and of itself.
Yeah, and as you were talking, one of the things, it kind of made me think about this concept of agency, right? And utilizing agency, of thinking, if I'm not bound by fear, then in essence, that means I get to choose whatever I want. I get to be whatever I want. I get to behave however I want. And in some sense, I get to maximize my agency. And so that then begs the question of, how do you maximize agency? And I think one of the things that we talked about a little bit is this idea of practice, right? Practice using agency when it isn't scary, or when I'm not afraid of something. So push a boundary just a little bit, or do something that I wouldn't necessarily have done before, not because I'm scared of it, but because I'm trying to push that boundary of agency. And if I can do it in a safe environment, or if I can feel like there's little to lose if I use my agency in the wrong way, then I can apply that practice to something else that I might feel like has higher stakes. And so I think there's room for deliberate practice, and then applying that strength of agency to overcoming fear.
Yeah. I think all of this speaks to how the line between something bad and something good when it comes to the things that cause us fear is actually very thin and maybe even malleable. And it's just an almost invisible threshold to something really, really positive, something enjoyable almost. I have watched lots of like stand-up comics, and I've even seen some documentaries where they start to talk about how they develop their love of comedy and how they craft the jokes that they make. And something that they consistently say, all the greats throughout history have said, is that the same things that make up painful experiences make up comedic experiences. It's the way that you approach it that it can suddenly cause laughter, or it can cause, you know, the pain and the fear that people can associate with negative experiences. So when you tell a joke about someone slipping and falling, you tell it in a way that allows us to embrace that with some humor, rather than embracing that with the cringe of this person is hurt or something like that. And they would even say, like, the most basic form of a joke is you set something up and the punchline subverts that. There's uncertainty in and of that of itself. You say something that you wouldn't normally say. You say something that maybe you're not even normally allowed to say in a certain context. But now in this certain perspective, it's funny because you subverted what we were expecting, the same way that horror movies subvert what we're expecting, but in a negative kind of perspective. And so I think that's a brilliant example of how, if you digest it and process it in the right way, if you approach this in the right way, what is fearful could be pleasurable.
I think that's really valuable. And I think one of the other things that I think about, and again, especially as we kind of gear ourselves up for Halloween, is oftentimes fear is based on like a suspended sense of disbelief, right? Like I walk into a haunted house and logically I know none of this is real. But the further you get into it, the more you kind of suspend that this isn't real, and you get put into the moment of something very scary could happen, or at any moment something's going to come out and try to startle me. And I think that sometimes we can go through life in a very similar way of we suspend that disbelief. We forget the version of ourselves that's capable of, that's confident, that has the resources necessary to do this thing. And I think in some sense, it sometimes is just a reality check to say, is what I'm experiencing actually happening?
Right.
Taking that moment, it's almost like, now with a lot of television shows since reality TV came about, they now talk to the camera, right? So they break that barrier between us and them. And it reminds us, oh, this is all fake. Like this is, I've engaged in this whole thing. And I think in some sense, if we can do that same thing, like break that fourth wall with ourselves and be like, do I really have something to be afraid of here? That's another way where we can kind of take control of a situation and kind of maximize our resources and say, what is it about me? What version of me? What resources do I have that makes this thing actually powerless? I think that can be a really useful tool in overcoming our fears as well.
Yeah, that speaks to how much, all of these things, I guess, speak to how much power we have in any of the situations that we're facing. We think this fear is all about the thing itself, whatever this task is or the context or whatever. But I think it says more about us in the situation. And so if we make these modifications in the way that you're describing, and that this whole conversation has described, we break that fourth wall and we ask ourselves those questions, or if we start to remember the kinds of people that we are and the kinds of things that we can do, suddenly now fear is not quite the response. Something else might start to fill that space.
Yeah. So I guess if we wrap this all up, one of the things I would say is a lot of overcoming fear is a purposeful interaction, right? It's a way of changing your perspective. And so I guess that's maybe a challenge to each of us as we go into, engaging with this scary season. I think any season of our life might be a scary season of our life. And so pausing for a moment and kind of taking stock of, what do I have that will help me make it through this? What might I learn through this journey toward a moment of success? Thinking about, how do I change this moment to be something really useful? And it reminds me of one more story. I was talking to one of my really good friends who had a very traumatic experience happen to her. And she, as a result of this experience, went to a trauma-focused CBT therapist. And the emphasis of trauma-focused CBT is to break down in the smallest nuanced detail all of the happenings. What did you see? What did you hear? What did you smell? What feelings did you have? What physical sensations did you have, right? And as you recount that, the idea is you recount all of these things in what now is a safe environment. And over time, the power of that experience lessens in its effectiveness. And one of the things that she started talking about is, as I went through this experience, it actually had the opposite impact on me. I started really thinking about these things, and all of those tiny details came back to my mind in great magnitude. And she said this is actually what helped kind of tip her into thinking about engaging in solution-focused brief therapy, is that she went to lunch with a friend, and the friend started asking her questions around like, well, how did you know in that moment how to do that particular thing? Or how did you know to make that particular deal or to ask that particular question? And she said, as he started asking her really minute, detailed questions about the exact same experience, but these questions were about resilience, or these things were about how did she keep her wits about her? How did she know exactly how to stand to protect somebody else that was involved in the situation? She realized that she was giving as detailed an account, but the detailed account she was giving were about strength and resilience. And I think that's such a powerful example of overcoming fear, we can either pay attention to these minute details, these physical sensations, and we can really magnify those details, or we can magnify different details around how are we coping, how are we managing, how are we getting better, how are we becoming stronger,
Right.
as we engage in that same thing. And so I think that's one of the things that I would hope people take away from this is what we magnify could either make our fear bigger and worse, or it could make our strength bigger and better.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think we can only tell a story to ourselves in so many ways at once, right? And so if we're magnifying one thing over another, I think that's what has an impact on us. And so why not magnify the strength and resilience that you needed for a situation instead of how the fear might have been instilled in you in that situation? Yeah, I think that's brilliant.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, hopefully that's helpful.
This podcast is sponsored by the Solution Focused Universe, a global community dedicated to the growth of professionals who want to master the solution focused approach. The SFU is home to the world's largest library of solution focused material, which is updated on a monthly basis. Join fellow community members and solution focused leaders in coaching calls and private Facebook groups to discuss anything and everything related to solution focused brief therapy.